Time and Place by GingerBaggins, Chapter 8, Tables That Turn. Draco struggled to relax for hours after he had gotten home. There was too much to consider, too much to analyze, too much everything. He broke it all down into a list, trying his best to use his occlumency training without actually calling upon the long-abandoned skill. 1. Granger was trying to win a war that had already been won, by doing something that had already been done, and she didn't yet know what exactly it was. He'd almost doubled over and vomited when she told him. How could he find himself back here after all these years? How could she? Surely she had nothing left to give. The war had hollowed them all, and yet there she was, covered in dried mud and leaves, and giving. And so he had no excuse this time. The opportunity had presented itself for him to right some wrongs, and he had to take it. He had to get it right. He had to make sure she wasn't left to do this alone. He would not watch her crawl along the floor ever again. He would help. 2. They were friends now. Enough that her disappearance had caused him quite an alarming amount of stress. He'd called upon every bloody Gryffindor he knew to ask if they had seen her, worried she'd maybe snuck out while he was checking the clock in the hall, or want to find Kingsley. He'd sat there and stared into her office for hours, listening only to the rapid beating of his own heart, until she materialized before him, looking like she'd been dragged through a bush. The relief he'd felt was almost tangible. It was a sick sort of karma. He'd become friends with Granger only to realize that she was a fucking liability. 3. She really was quite beautiful, and this was possibly the most disturbing of all revelations. It's not that he'd not noticed before, but he'd never really known it until now. The image of her standing in his office, flustered, and handing him coffee over an apology she did not owe him, was now burned into the back of his eyelids. The way her cheeks had flushed red, the way her eyes had darted between his, the way she'd stepped towards instead of backwards. It had all been rather unfortunately arousing. He touched her back on the way to the flue, and his fingers still tingled from the contact as though he were a teenager. Truly pathetic. Perhaps it had been too long since he'd been with a nice woman, and his loneliness led him to read into what was a really new and exceedingly delicate friendship, one that he had no intention of blowing up just because his dick had a mind of its own. Granger was beautiful, and it changed nothing. The fact he spent the following day locked in his office avoiding her meant nothing. The fact that she didn't knock on his door once also meant nothing. And the fact that he flew to Theo's immediately after the day was done with a bottle of Ogden meant nothing either. "What have you done?" Theo mused from his sofa, eyebrows quirked at the sight of Draco emerging from the fireplace. "Why do you always assume I've done something?" he replied, feigning offense. Theo put down the book he was reading to reveal a cigarette hanging loosely from his lips. He took a long drag for dramatic effect before offering a response. "Well, haven't you?" Draco sighed and stepped into the vast lounge area filled with pristine mahogany, furnishings that he knew for a fact did not splinter nearly as frequently as his own. "I touched Granger's lower back." Theo gasped, leaning forward in his chair. "You filthy pervert." "Don't be a prick. It's nothing. I'm just touch deprived." "Draco, mate, in our circles, it's basically the equivalent of bending her over the arm of the sofa and—" "Okay, Theo," he winced. Theo summoned 2 glasses and waited for Draco to pour them each a generous amount of Ogden. They both drank the first glass quickly and in silence, thoughtful on Draco's end and amused on Theo's, before instantly refilling. "So you touched Granger's lower back. What does that mean?" he eventually asked. Draco laughed, running his hand through his hair and messing his usually immaculate charms. "Nothing. As I said, it was just strange." "Doesn't sound like nothing," Theo said with a smirk that Draco wished to smack from his face. "I thought she didn't like you." We're friends now. It's new." Even he could hear how insane he sounded. I think I just need to get laid. Theo shot forward and clapped his hands in glee. Now we're talking. Shine those shoes and let's get out of here. Yes, this was why he came here. He needed a night out with his friend to drown himself in the bottom of a bottle and possibly between the legs of a woman he did not have years of tormented history with. He needed Theo to shake some sense into him, to forget about the fact that he could still smell jasmine. If he tried hard enough, he may even be able to convince himself that he wanted all of this just as much as he needed it. Before he had time to overthink, Theo was dragging him into the fireplace and yelling for the leaky cauldron. It was a weeknight, which meant the place was mostly empty, except for the few regulars who were practically permanent fixtures at the bar. Theo ordered him a bottle and ushered him to the table in the far corner. Draco let his gaze roam across the room, lips lifting into a coy smile that felt more familiar than the grimace he'd been wearing for the last few hours. I don't think our prospects are looking good, he said, eyeing the drunk wizard who was bent over at a near 90-degree angle in the corner. No, but it's cheap enough to get you drunk, and then I can convince you to go to a club. Theo shrugged. Strapped for gold, not. Not me, prick. You're the one with a budget, he chuckled, pouring the drinks. Having more money than a Malfoy is a novelty that will never wear off. Draco rolled his eyes. He wasn't exactly sure he could call it a novelty, but he'd made his choice a long time ago, and he didn't regret it for a second. Money had once meant everything to him. It was what set him apart from those he deemed lesser. It was what he was born to manage, to flaunt. His recent independence had taught him something that he'd never once considered before: value. Now everything he owned was his. Everything he brought, he earned. It was frustrating and stressful and profoundly freeing. I'll even spare you from the wingman duty this evening, Theo mused, sipping at his whiskey. Your date went well then? Theo did it like it was a sport. He was relentless. It helped that he was a well-groomed, well-educated, and well-off sort of fellow, but even Draco had to begrudgingly admit that all the rest paled in the face of his unrestrainable charm. In their youth, it had always been the other way around. Draco was the witty little loudmouth who used misplaced charisma to obtain the attention he sought, while Theo had managed to remain so far under the radar that barely anyone even knew he was there. But times had changed, Draco had changed, and now Theo was often 10 strides ahead of him. No, he groaned. He was dreadfully boring and had far too much to say about horses. Horses? Theo let out a long-suffering smile. Yes, horses, not thestrials or dragons or any other creature that may have held my interest for longer than a minute. He was just really into horses. Wait, riding them? I can only hope so. I turned him out quite effectively, he said, flashing a toothy grin. It's remarkable how much thinking you can get done when in the company of a dull man. That is where I went wrong during my studies. I'd have gotten so much revision done if I'd only sought out horsemen. I believe they're called centaurs. If he were a centaur, this would be a very different story. Not an ounce of revision would get done if... Theo cut off, his brow furrowing at something over Draco's shoulder. When did Weasley become fit? Draco nearly gagged and turned towards the bar, feeling a wave of relief when he found a completely different Weasley from the one he'd expected. George was ordering 2 butterbeers, leaning with the same confidence he and his brother always carried in Hogwarts. There had always been very little Draco had been able to do to ruffle either of their feathers, something he found himself immensely grateful for in hindsight. George was secondary to Ginevra on Draco's list of Weasleys, which was saying something. It was a fairly long list. Do you want me to introduce you? Draco asked, only half joking. Last he'd known, George was seeing a girl from his year at school, Angelina. She'd once dated the other twin, something which everyone had silently agreed was rather uncomfortable. He briefly remembered the more unfavorable Weasley talking about it with Potter, when they should have been writing case reports. Draco had cursed the fact he'd been placed in the cubicle between theirs daily. It was one of the many reasons he had to remain utterly professional in his new role. No matter how lovely the eyes of his new colleague were, he'd had a taste of the good life, a stacked shelf, an office of his own. He couldn't go back to the DMLE now, not unless dragged kicking and screaming. "Oh shit," Theo was laughing now, loud and rumbling, his head thrown back against his shoulders. Draco froze. His blood turned to ice, because he knew that laugh meant trouble, and there was only one kind of trouble that could drag that sound out of him this evening. Draco turned slowly, eyes finding the redhead almost as easily as they found his bushy-haired companion. Circe, Merlin, Morgana, Salazar himself, he cursed them all. "We need to leave," he snapped, turning back to Theo. This only seemed to exasperate Theo's amusement, and he roared with laughter again. Draco winced. The place was empty enough for the sound to carry to where the witch he'd come out to forget stood. "This is brilliant," Theo gasped, and to Draco's absolute horror, he kept his hand around his mouth. "Golden Girl, join us, won't you?" "Are you fucking insane?" Draco hissed, but it was far too late. He turned his head back to see the damaged and found Granger staring back at them, wearing an expression eerily like the one found upon Theo's face. 2 parts thrilled, 1 part smug. Granger, however, looked as though she had been hexed. All color drained from her usual rosy cheeks. Her hands gripped her butterbeer so tightly that he worried she would shatter the glass. He watched as George threw an arm over her shoulder and whispered something in her ear. She scoffed and pushed him off before they both made their way towards the table. Draco was going to throw up, pass out, or maybe run screaming like a fucking coward because there was no way this would end in anything except utter disaster. "Theodore not." Her voice came out a lot steadier than she looked. Theo beamed like the fucking sun. "You know who I am," he explained, gesturing for them to take the empty chairs. The second Granger seated herself beside Draco. He regretted his decision to call upon Theo for any kind of help. He'd expected it to be just them, but there was certainly no changing it now, not unless Granger had smuggled the time turner out of the office. He wouldn't put it past her. "Of course I do," she replied, frowning. "Have you met George?" George held out a hand, and he took it enthusiastically. Draco nearly rolled his eyes at the showing. Theo was practically devouring the man through sight alone. Then again, George was hardly backing away from his obvious display. "Drinking with snakes," George laughed, shaking his head. Theo threw him his most dazzling smile. "Sitting with lions." Granger groaned, and Draco was suddenly glad to have at least one other person who felt as uncomfortable as he did. He shifted, accidentally knocking their knees together, and looked over to her in panic. She hadn't even flinched. Instead, she was watching the 2 wizards on opposite ends of the table with a subtle reverence as they shamelessly flirted back and forth. She caught his eye. A shy little blush crawled up her neck as she watched him, and he held his glass tighter. "Hi," she said quietly. Shit, this was bad. "Hi," he replied, jutting his chin toward their company, still absorbed in separate conversations. "Theo is going to try and shag him if we don't step in." Granger snorted. "Good for them. I didn't know Weasley swung that way." "George swing in every direction," she said, glancing back over to the redhead with sparkling eyes. "Is there any reason to worry about Theo?" "Plenty, but not regarding this." She pursed her lips and nodded, turning her attention back to her drink. "He probably should have done the same. He could have kept quiet, gotten involved in the blooming debate about the best parchment to use for origami, a topic that he was sure neither Theo or George cared about nearly as much as they were pretending to. Maybe he should have just forced a yawn and bid them all good night, but he didn't, because he wanted to talk to his friend, the blushing witch beside him. "Did we ruin your evening?" he asked. "Obliterated it," she said before gesturing to George. "Though I fear you may have saved his." He quirked a brow. "I must admit, I'm shocked to see you out on a school night. I'd assumed you'd be in bed with at least 3 books by now." Often think about me in bed, Malfoy, she asked and then turned quite an alarming shade of magenta. His lungs were crawling up his throat. He couldn't have spoken if she'd let him. Thankfully, she did not let him. I planned to bore him to death all night, talking about work. And to think I had to make an unbreakable vow before you spoke to me about it. She rolled her eyes. Not the nature of the work, just the stresses of it. He wondered if he was one of those stresses. If his surely obvious behavioral shift had made her uncomfortable, he needed to get a grip, and fast. Anything I can do to help? He asked sincerely, and she returned an equally sincere smile. You are already helping, she said, and his chest felt too tight. Just keep brewing, you'll get there. Though now you mention it, I have been curious about what you needed the bat tongues for. Ah, he settled. This was the kind of conversation he had grown accustomed to having with her. I have a new theory. Her eyes lit up instantly. Her body turned towards him almost unknowingly, her curiosity acting like a magnet. Bat tongue is used in aging potions, as your friend here would remember. I'm wondering if there is a way to mix the stasis properties of Draught of Living Death and a typical aging potion. Would that not send me straight to sleep? She asked, brows furrowed. He could almost see the information turning over in her mind. Well, it's still an early theory, he reminded her, snapping her out of her reverie. I was waiting to show you until I had something more solid. You have research notes? He nodded once. I'll show you in the morning. She was beaming, and he couldn't deny the pride he felt swell at the sight. She had told him that she'd hired him based on his qualifications, but it was only in these moments that he allowed himself to believe it. He had wasted so much time hating her at school when they could have been helping each other excel all along. They turned their attentions back to Theo and George, who both seemed peeved to break up their private conversation and allow them in, but only briefly. George told them about the new sweets he was working on, taffies that would cause the unfortunate eater to grow horrific toe fungus for 48 hours, and Draco made a mental note to never eat anything that George offered him. Theo told stories of his studies, a topic which Granger latched onto with the enthusiasm of a starved leech. What was your thesis on? She asked, legs bouncing below the table. Theo shot a semi-nervous glance to Draco, and he nodded in return. It was about time Theo had the opportunity to share in his academic successes. Theoretical alternatives to Skeely grow. You'd think after hundreds of years we'd have found some way to repair bones that isn't so painful and laborious. It's all potential, obviously. Draco helped with a lot of the research. He did? She asked, throwing an impressed glance his way. Theo was nothing if not a dedicated wingman. I'd very much like to read it. Theo paused, eyes widening. You would? Granger nodded eagerly, and guilt swirled in Draco's gut as Theo's shoulders sagged in relief. He'd purposefully kept Theo from the people who could help him the most, due to his own shame and fear. Yet, in only an hour, Granger had offered an interest in his work without prompt and reignited the eager light in his eye that Draco had watched slowly dim with every rejection. A better friend would have been singing his praises at every opportunity. A better friend would have swallowed his pride and used his connections. Draco's road to redemption had been far too self-involved, and he saw it now, as he watched his friends, old and new, bloom without the mediation he thought they'd require. He kept mostly quiet as the night progressed. They'd ordered another round of butterbeers for the table, which Theo insisted was his treat before winking at Weasley. The two of them carried the bulk of conversation, verbally sparring as though they'd known each other for years and not only a handful of hours. Granger shared a few stories of George from their youth, and he noticed how carefully she tiptoed around the mention of his late twin. He also noticed how George's eyes flashed with a brief spark of pain each time anyway. He had always known the two of them to be troublemakers. At times he thought them to be imbeciles. Only now did he realize how ahead they were for their years. George made a shocking number of jokes about his missing ear, all of which Granger scoffed at as though she had heard them 1,000 times before. Potter and Granger had always been honorary Weasleys. It was a well-known fact. He'd not expected there to be such a depth between her and the extended family. George had a fiercely protective way of speaking about her, which was underlined by an even fiercer look that Draco seemed to be the only one on the receiving end of. As the night went on, the two wizards on the other side of the table gravitated closer towards each other, hats bowed together as they spoke in low voices that neither Granger nor Draco could make out. Granger yawned, and he thanked the gods for it. It was time to leave before Theo stuck his tongue in the redhead's mouth, which was undoubtedly where this was all headed. Draco excused himself, reasoning that he'd surely burn his fingers off if he fell asleep over the brewing station in the morning. Granger jumped at the opportunity to join him on his walk to the apparition point, and after a tight hug from Weasley and a demand that Theo send his thesis by owl the following day, she joined him at the door. "Think they'll be all right?" she asked as they stepped out into the bitter winter air. She shivered, and he cast a wordless warming charm over her. "Thank you. They'll be more than all right, though I do hope this doesn't become a common occurrence." "Which part?" she asked, taking twice the number of steps he did just to keep up with his long strides. He slowed. "Them or us?" He fought a smile with everything he had. "Them. They have the potential to be insufferable, whereas I've grown rather fond of your company." "Ah," she said in a small voice, and he glanced over to see the blush reappear on her cheeks. "In that case, you should join me for lunch when I invite you. Harry and Ronald have been asking after you." "I can only assume the entire department has fallen to pieces without me," he chuckled. "Did you like being in Auror?" she asked, and her question gave him a pause. Did he enjoy it? In a way. It was never what he'd wanted, never what he'd imagined. Then again, he'd not imagined much for himself after he'd taken the mark. Everything after that was either a gift or a curse. The job had saved him from a life in a cell. It had offered him the opportunity to make amends with the people he directly hurt the most, and it offered him a chance at the redemption he hadn't deserved. It put him in the right place at the right time when Hermione Granger was looking for a potions master. But had he liked it? No, he hadn't. He'd not liked the paperwork, he'd not liked the stakes, the fighting, the retelling of the worst information he'd retained from the war. It'd been important work, but he was in no rush to return. "I was grateful for the opportunity," he settled on. She had been the one to secure him the deal after all. He mustn't appear sour. She hummed quietly, looking at him with that puzzled expression again. "That's not what I asked." "Swotty little witch." "No, I didn't like it," he admitted. She didn't pry, nor did she push. She merely nodded and kept up the pace alongside him until they reached the apparition point. They whirled on each other as they arrived, each waiting for the other to depart first, staring in anticipation. He wasn't sure what the etiquette was. A hug was more intimate than touching her lower back, and that was the cause of his venture out. No, a hug was off the table. Perhaps he should shake her hand? No, too formal. Just a goodbye? He could just say goodnight and have it over and done. A hand rested on his arm and gave it a small, gentle squeeze. He held his breath as he watched her, cheeks still pink, curls blowing around her face as though lifted by the magic in her veins. Her lips ticked upwards, and her arm dropped back to the side. "See you in the morning, Malfoy." And then she was gone, and he was left with a breath held in his lungs, his ears ringing with the sound of her voice, and the glorious way it shaped around his nape. This was really bad. And that's the end of chapter 8.